What happens when a homeowners association president storms a man's cabin with police, only to find the state's attorney general waiting inside? The answer shook an entire neighborhood. The pounding on the door was so sharp it rattled the frame. Trevor Gaines looked up from the table, startled. Papers were spread out in front of him, county maps, highlighted sections of shoreline property rights, and a legal pad scrawled with notes. Across from him, State Attorney General Roland Pike adjusted his glasses and gave a dry smile. "You expecting company, Trevor?" Roland asked, his voice steady. Trevor shook his head. "Not a soul. Everyone knows this place is quiet. Or at least it's supposed to be." The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Open up! Homeowners Association business." Trevor's jaw tightened. He recognized that voice immediately. Judith Carraway, president of the HOA. A woman who carried herself like she owned the entire community, even though her title was little more than an elected volunteer position. Trevor rose slowly. His cabin, perched on the edge of Lake Keowee in South Carolina, wasn't just a weekend escape, it was his stake in something bigger. He had bought it after years of hard work in logistics, paying cash, determined to enjoy fishing weekends with his brothers and late-night bonfires with his nieces and nephews. Yet from the moment the ink dried on his purchase, Judith had found reasons to check in. From mailbox placement to the color of his porch chairs, she had turned small matters into big disputes. Now she had escalated to banging on his door with the police standing by. Trevor opened it cautiously. And there she was, Judith Carraway, clutching a binder under one arm, her lips pressed so tightly together it looked painful. Beside her stood two uniformed officers from the Oconee County Sheriff's Department, hands resting on their belts, faces unreadable. "Mr. Gaines," Judith began, in that clipped tone she used when addressing people she thought beneath her. "We need to discuss your ongoing violations." Trevor didn't move aside. He kept one hand on the edge of the doorframe, the other resting casually against the wood, steady as stone. "Violations," he said calmly. "This is my property. I know my rights." Roland Pike's voice carried from behind him, sharp and unmistakable. "And so do I." Judith blinked, craning her neck toward the inside. Her eyes widened. Roland Pike was no ordinary guest. His name was on headlines, his face on the evening news. He was the Attorney General of South Carolina, a man whose presence changed the weight of every word in that room. For the first time, Judith's authority faltered. "Attorney General Pike," she stammered. I didn't realize you were here." Roland leaned back in his chair, unhurried. "Clearly, and I'm curious, Ms. Carraway, on what grounds you've entered this man's property with law enforcement in tow. I'd like to hear it directly." The officers exchanged a glance, silent. They hadn't expected this either. Judith recovered quickly, flipping open her binder. "Mr. Gaines has made unapproved modifications to the shoreline, extended his dock beyond the permitted limit, added lighting that doesn't conform with our guidelines." Trevor cut her off, his tone firm but measured. "Every change I made is within county code. I checked it myself. And as you can see, I've been meeting with the Attorney General to review these very issues." He gestured to the paperwork spread across the table behind him. The cabin air felt thick. Outside, the faint call of a loon echoed across the lake, a sound that normally carried peace, but now seemed like background noise to something brewing larger. Roland stood, adjusting his suit jacket. He walked slowly toward the doorway, his gaze fixed on Judith. "I've seen enough of these neighborhood disputes," he said evenly. "But when an HOA president uses her position to drag police officers into private property without cause, that raises questions." Big ones Judith swallowed hard. Her binder seemed heavier in her arms. The officers shifted, suddenly aware that they were no longer standing in neutral territory, but in the middle of a confrontation that could blow up far beyond their pay grade. Trevor didn't gloat, though he could have. He simply stepped back, making space for Roland to stand shoulder to shoulder with him in the doorway. Trevor broke the tension with a simple, steady line. "You came here thinking you could intimidate me. Instead, you walked into something you weren't ready for." The words hung in the air. Judith's face flushed crimson, her authority unraveling in real time. And yet this was just the beginning. But what came after that doorway confrontation would ripple through the entire community, exposing not just Judith's motives, but the fragile balance of power in neighborhoods everywhere. The silence at the cabin doorway stretched longer than anyone expected. Judith Carraway stood stiff as a post, her binder pressed to her chest like a shield. The two deputies kept their hands close to their belts, but still made no move to speak. And inside the cabin, Trevor Gaines and Attorney General Roland Pike waited, calm but steady, like they were ready for every excuse Judith might throw. It was Trevor who broke the stillness first. "You've brought officers onto my property, Judith. Why don't you explain to them, and to me, exactly what I've supposedly done wrong?" Judith cleared her throat. "Mr. Gaines, as president of the Lake Kiowa Homeowners Association, it's my duty to enforce the community's bylaws. You've repeatedly ignored notices regarding your dock, and your lighting system is disruptive to the neighborhood." Roland leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms. His voice was low, calm, but carried the kind of weight that made people listen. "Notices, Miss Carraway? Or accusations?" "There's a difference." Judith shifted her stance, clearly rattled but unwilling to back down. "The bylaws are very clear. Any extension of a dock requires approval from the HOA board." "He didn't submit the proper forms?" Trevor's lips curved into a dry half-smile. "I submitted everything. Twice. Got nothing back but silence. That's why I asked the Attorney General here today, to review whether the HOA's enforcement has been fair." The deputies glanced at each other again. Neither had expected to walk into a situation where the state's top lawman was not only present, but openly siding with the homeowner they were supposed to check on. Roland pushed off the frame and stepped closer to Judith. His eyes never wavered. "Miss Carraway, I want you to listen carefully. Property rights in South Carolina are not dictated by personal preference or selective interpretation of rules. If this homeowner followed county codes and submitted the required forms, then your personal dislike of his improvements doesn't give you authority to escalate with police involvement." Judith's cheeks reddened. Her voice took on a brittle edge. "This isn't about dislike. This is about maintaining standards. We all work hard to preserve the community's value." Trevor's tone hardened, though he kept his volume controlled. "Standards for some, not for all. I've seen the way you ignore other neighbors' projects. I put in a few extra feet of dock, and suddenly you're at my door with a binder and backup." For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside, the lake glimmered under the afternoon sun, calm and endless. But the tension in that doorway felt anything but calm. Roland finally gestured toward the table inside. "Why don't we bring this conversation in here? You've barged into a man's cabin. You might as well hear what we were actually discussing." The deputies hesitated, but when Trevor stepped back to open the door wider, neither of them objected. Judith followed, her heels clicking against the wooden floor as though each step announced her refusal to lose face. Inside, the cabin was simple but warm. Pine walls, a stone fireplace, and that big table covered with maps and legal notes. Roland returned to his seat and tapped one of the documents with his finger. "This," he said, "is what we were reviewing. Shoreline access disputes across this county. Multiple homeowners have been blocked or harassed when they attempted to use their property in ways that are fully legal. Mr. Gaines is not the only one raising concerns. His situation fits a much larger pattern." Judith's mouth opened, but Roland raised a hand before she could speak. "You walked in here thinking this was about one dock. It's not. It's about whether your authority is being applied equally, or whether it's being weaponized against certain homeowners while others get a free pass." Trevor leaned forward, looking directly at Judith. "Like the Johnsons down the road. Their dock has been extended for years, and they've got string lights hanging all the way across it. Did you send deputies to their door?" Judith's lips pressed together. She didn't answer. Roland's voice cut in again. "That silence says more than your binder ever will." The deputies shifted uneasily. One finally spoke, his voice cautious. "Ma'am, maybe we should step back from this. If the Attorney General is investigating these disputes, we don't want to interfere where we don't have authority." Judith spun toward him, flustered. "I called you because I thought this was a simple matter of enforcement." Doesn't look simple to me, the deputy replied. Judith stood frozen, her binder trembling slightly in her hands. Her power had always come from intimidation, from being the loudest and most forceful voice in the room. But now, her voice carried no weight at all. Trevor watched her, calm but unyielding. You wanted to put me on the defensive, Judith. Instead, you've just put yourself there. The Attorney General's words sealed the moment. This isn't over, and I'll make sure of that. The cabin was silent again, except for the faint creak of wood as Judith finally turned and walked out the door, her steps sharp, almost frantic. The officers followed, leaving Trevor and Roland standing side by side in the glow of the afternoon light. For Trevor, the confrontation felt like a turning point. He wasn't just defending himself anymore, he was part of something larger, something that could change how power was used in their community. But outside those cabin walls, word was already spreading, and what happened next would turn one confrontation into a storm that touched every corner of the neighborhood. The cabin door shut behind Judith and the two deputies with a dull thud, leaving the room filled with a silence that carried more weight than the shouting match that had just ended. Trevor leaned back against the table, exhaling slowly, while Roland Pike studied the papers in front of him as if to ground the moment. Trevor broke the quiet first. I should have known she'd try something like this. Judith's been looking for a way to corner me since the day I moved in. Roland didn't look up. His voice was even, almost detached. She's not unique, Trevor. People like her wrap themselves in rules because it makes them feel untouchable. But rules twisted out of shape are nothing more than weapons. Trevor gave a short laugh, but it was humorless. Weapons aimed at the wrong people. He crossed the room and poured himself a glass of water, his hands steady, though his eyes still burned with the heat of the confrontation. The funny thing? She probably thought she was doing the community a favor, keeping everything in line. But whose line? Her own? Roland finally looked up, his gaze sharp. That's the question. And it's the one I'll be asking, loudly. Before Trevor could answer, there was a sound outside. Not another knock, not police sirens, but muffled voices. Curious and cautious, Trevor moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek. Two neighbors stood by the road. One was Mr. Jennings, who lived 3 doors down, his hands on his hips, shaking his head. The other, a woman Trevor barely knew, leaned close to him, whispering. Both kept looking toward the cabin. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Trevor muttered, "Well, that didn't take long." Roland joined him at the window. "It never does. Neighborhoods thrive on stories. And this one, an HOA president storming a cabin with cops only to run into the state attorney general? That's the kind of story that grows bigger by the minute." Trevor let the curtain fall back. He turned toward Roland. "So what now? You said this isn't over. What happens next?" Roland's expression was unreadable, but his tone carried certainty. "Next, we test whether people like Judith can keep hiding behind titles. Because she won't retreat quietly. She'll double down, try to spin the story, claim she was protecting the community." Trevor folded his arms. "She's got allies. A lot of them. People who like things just the way they are." Roland nodded slowly. "And that's where it gets messy. This isn't just about you, Trevor. This is about everyone who's been quietly stepped on, but never had a voice strong enough to push back." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Both men turned toward the door as a pickup pulled into the drive. Out stepped a broad-shouldered man with silver hair tucked under a ball cap. Trevor's face softened. "That's Frank Dillman. He's been here 30 years. Retired firefighter Frank walked up to the porch with deliberate steps. When Trevor opened the door, Frank's eyes swept past him, landing on Roland. "I heard what just went down," Frank said, his voice gravelly but calm. "Word's traveling fast. Judith stomping around, saying you disrespected her authority, but plenty of folks are tired of her power trips. Thought you should know you've got support." Trevor motioned for him to come in. "Frank, this is Attorney General Pike." Roland extended his hand. "Good to meet you, Mr. Dillman." Frank shook it firmly. "Wish it was under better circumstances. I've watched Judith pull this stunt with others. Fines for lawn chairs, letters for paint colors. Folks don't fight back because they don't want the trouble. But barging into your place with the police? That's a step too far. Trevor caught the emphasis in his words. So you've seen the pattern, too, Frank nodded. I've lived long enough to spot when someone's hiding behind a rule book just to swing weight around. She'll play victim now, say she was only doing her job. But truth is, she's been running that HOA like it's her kingdom. Roland leaned forward, his lawyer's mind piecing together every detail. Your perspective matters, Mr. Dillman. People willing to speak on the record will make all the difference. Frank scratched his chin. I'll do it. Been quiet too long. The three men stood in the cabin, an unlikely alliance forged by one confrontation. Trevor felt the shift in the air. What had begun as an ambush was transforming into something larger, something that could shake Judith's grip on the neighborhood. But even with that support, Trevor knew this was far from over. Judith wasn't the type to accept humiliation. She would regroup, gather her allies, and return harder than before. Trevor glanced at Roland. She's not going to stop here. You know that Roland's reply was steady, certain. No, but neither will we. Frank pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket. HOA meeting's next Thursday. I guarantee she'll try to turn this into her stage. You'd better be ready. Trevor took the paper, his jaw firming. Then that's where the fight moves next. The three men exchanged a look of quiet agreement. Outside, the voices of neighbors still carried faintly on the breeze. The story was no longer contained. It was leaking through every fence, every backyard conversation, every email chain in the community. Inside the cabin, Trevor felt both the weight of the coming battle and the spark of something else. Resolve. He wasn't just standing for himself anymore. He was standing for every homeowner who had been silenced by intimidation. And with Roland Pike by his side, this fight was no longer on Judith's terms. But beyond the cabin walls, whispers were already becoming arguments, and the neighborhood was bracing for a showdown that would soon spill into the next HOA meeting. By the time the sun dipped low over Lake Kiowa, the story of what happened at Trevor Gaines's cabin had already taken on a life of its own. What started as a heavy knock on a wooden door had turned into a neighborhood-wide debate, spreading faster than any official notice Judith Carraway had ever mailed out. At the gas station near the main road, the clerk overheard two customers talking in hushed but animated tones. She barged in with deputies, one man said, shaking his head. And the Attorney General was sitting right there. Can you imagine? The look on her face must have been priceless half a mile away, in the parking lot of a diner where locals gathered for Catfish Fridays. The conversation was no different. A retired couple leaned over their plates, whispering. I heard Judith claimed it was all about rules, the woman said. But Frank Dillman told me Trevor filed all the paperwork. He said she ignored it. Selective enforcement, plain and simple. In a community where small stories usually revolved around who painted their shutters the wrong shade of beige or who left their trash cans out too long, this one hit differently. This was no longer a petty dispute. It was a clash that pulled in the state's top legal officer, and people couldn't resist weighing in. By the next morning, Trevor noticed subtle changes. Neighbors who usually looked the other way when Judith's name came up now greeted him with nods of encouragement. A few even stopped by his driveway just to say, "Heard what happened? Good on you for standing your ground," but support didn't come from everyone. On the neighborhood Facebook group, posts started piling up, some sympathetic, others sharply defensive of Judith. One message read, "The HOA protects property values. Without Judith, this place would fall apart. Don't let outsiders tear us down." Another, posted minutes later, fired back. Protect property values? Or protect control? There's a difference. Trevor scrolled through the posts one evening, shaking his head. She's already spinning it, he muttered. Roland Pike, seated across from him with a mug of coffee, glanced at the screen. Of course she is. That's how people like her survive. Turn the story before anyone else can? Trevor set the phone down. The worst part is, some folks will buy it. They'll say I'm stirring trouble, that I should have just let it go. Roland leaned back in his chair. Let it go? She stormed your cabin with armed deputies. If anything, you showed restraint. That matters. Trevor gave a short laugh. Restraint or not, she's got a loyal circle. People who believe every word she says. Just then, the doorbell rang. Trevor opened it to find a younger neighbor, a woman in her 30s named Callie Brenner, shifting nervously on the porch. She held a folder in her hands. "Trevor," she said quietly, "I'm sorry to bother you. I wanted to drop this off before the meeting next week." He frowned. "What is it?" She stepped inside and handed him the folder. Inside were copies of notices, fines, and warnings Judith had sent her over the past 2 years. Everything from complaints about the height of her fence to accusations that her children's basketball hoop violated neighborhood harmony. Callie's voice cracked slightly as she explained, "I didn't fight back. I just paid the fines because I didn't want trouble. But after what she did to you, I can't stay quiet anymore. People should know this isn't new. She's been doing it for years." Roland flipped through the documents, nodding slowly. "This is exactly what we need. Proof that Trevor's not the only one. If enough neighbors are willing to speak up, Judith's credibility will collapse." Trevor looked at Callie, grateful. "Thank you, I know it isn't easy." She gave a nervous smile. "It's easier now, knowing you're not afraid to stand up to her. A lot of us were waiting for someone to do it first." After she left, Trevor closed the folder and set it beside Frank Dillman's earlier notes. A small pile of evidence was starting to form, and with Roland's guidance, it was beginning to look like a case that could no longer be brushed aside as a personal disagreement. But even as the support grew, Trevor knew whispers weren't harmless. They carried weight. They spread faster than facts. And Judith was working just as hard to push her version of the story. Already a few of her allies were repeating the claim that Trevor was hostile and non-compliant, painting him as a disruptor. Outside, the lake shimmered under the last light of day, calm and steady, as if unaware of the storm brewing on its shores. For Trevor, the coming week would decide more than just his dark or his lights. It would decide whether truth had a chance to rise above rumor. But the whispers weren't just talk. They were fuel, carrying the fight straight toward the HOA meeting where Judith planned her counterattack. The Thursday night meeting was held in the small community center by the lake, a squat brick building with fluorescent lights that always hummed faintly overhead. Normally, HOA meetings drew a handful of residents, mostly retirees with time on their hands and a few board members ready to complain about lawn care. But that night, the parking lot was full, and people spilled through the doorway long before the meeting began. Trevor parked at the edge of the lot, his headlights sweeping across a sea of faces. Some smiled at him encouragingly. Others crossed their arms, waiting to see what would happen. In the passenger seat, Roland Pike sipped a bottle of water, his suit jacket draped across the back of the seat. "You're about to walk into her arena," Roland said, his tone even but serious. "Judith will use every trick she can, rules of order, procedure, her allies in the crowd. She'll try to paint you as a troublemaker. Stay calm. Speak clearly. Don't let her control the narrative." Trevor nodded, his hand tightening around the steering wheel. "I'm ready." Inside, the atmosphere was thick. Judith Carroway sat at the head of the long table, her binder in front of her like a sword ready to be drawn. Around her sat the other board members, a mix of people who looked either nervous or eager for the show. The seats for residents filled quickly, and a low murmur rolled across the room. Judith tapped the gavel sharply. "This meeting will come to order. We have several items on the agenda tonight, but given recent events, I believe it's best we address community concerns first." She scanned the room, her eyes landing squarely on Trevor. "Mr. Gaines, you've raised quite a commotion. Would you care to explain yourself to your neighbors?" Trevor stood slowly, his back straight. "Explain myself? Judith, you came to my cabin with police officers. You accused me of violations I didn't commit. And when you did, the Attorney General of this state happened to be sitting at my table reviewing the very documents you claim I ignored." A ripple of whispers passed through the crowd. Some residents leaned forward, others exchanged glances. Judith's smile was thin, but her voice carried. "You make it sound as if I acted improperly. But let's remember, we have bylaws for a reason. We can't have individuals disregarding them whenever they feel like it. That's how communities decline." Trevor's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of the last week's tension. "This isn't about bylaws. This is about selective enforcement, about you ignoring forms, ignoring fairness, and using your position to target people. And it's not just me. Others in this room have been through the same thing. From the back, Frank Dillman raised his voice. That's right. She's been after me for years over nonsense. Paint chips, a shed too close to the line, things nobody else ever gets called out for. A few people clapped quietly, while others stayed stone-faced. Judith banged her gavel. Order! This is not the time for grandstanding. Roland Pike rose then, his presence commanding attention. The murmurs stopped immediately. With respect, Ms. Carraway, this is precisely the time for accountability. I've spent the past week reviewing complaints from multiple residents. What I see is a troubling pattern of power used not to maintain standards, but to intimidate. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Judith's face flushed. This is a homeowners meeting, not a courtroom. You have no jurisdiction here. Roland's tone sharpened. The law applies everywhere, Ms. Carraway. If residents are being harassed under the guise of community standards, that's not just an internal matter. That's a matter of public interest. The board members shifted uncomfortably. One, a middle-aged woman named Sandra Kim, cleared her throat. Judith, I've had concerns too. Maybe we should hear them out? Judith's gavel slammed again. We will not turn this meeting into a witch hunt against your president. Trevor stepped closer to the table. You want to talk about witch hunts? That's exactly what you've been running. Callie Brenner, care to speak up? Callie stood, holding her folder of notices. Her voice trembled at first, but she grew stronger as she spoke. I kept quiet because I was scared. But I've been fined and harassed for things that others get away with all the time. My kids can't even play basketball in the driveway without a letter from Judith. A wave of murmurs swept the room again. Some residents nodded, others looked down uncomfortably. Judith's composure cracked. The meeting was slipping out of Judith's hands. For years, she had controlled the narrative, wielded her binder and her gavel like weapons. But tonight, she was cornered, not by Trevor alone, but by neighbors who were finally finding their voices. Trevor glanced around the room, catching eyes, steady and unwavering. This isn't about one dock, one light, or one basketball hoop. This is about whether this community belongs to all of us, or just the few who think they can dictate the rest. The room erupted, some with applause, others with angry mutters. The divide was sharp, undeniable. Judith slammed her gavel again, but the sound no longer silenced anyone. But while the community center walls echoed with arguments and applause, the real question lingered. Would the board and the deputies watching from the sidelines take action, or would Judith find a way to claw back control? The morning after the heated HOA meeting, the spotlight shifted away from Judith Carraway alone. Whispers turned toward the two deputies who had followed her to Trevor Gaines's cabin without hesitation. In a small town, law enforcement lived side by side with the people they served. Everyone knew the officers' names, where they went to church, and who their kids played ball with. That familiarity made the questions sting even more. Why did they go along with Judith? Why didn't they ask for a warrant? At the diner on Highway 183, the usual chatter over biscuits and coffee had a different tone. Deputies shouldn't be acting like Judith's personal enforcers, one man muttered, flipping his newspaper closed. A woman across the counter replied, They didn't even ask Trevor for permission. Just stood there like backup muscle. The local paper picked up the story the same afternoon. The headline wasn't flattering. HOA dispute draws state attention. Role of deputies under review. Beneath it was a photo of Trevor's lakeside cabin, sunlight glinting off the water as though mocking the chaos that had erupted inside. Inside the sheriff's office, Sheriff Leon McAdams called the two deputies, Matt Barlow and Chris Dunley, into his office. His voice was measured, but his eyes were sharp. You two need to tell me exactly what happened out there. Every detail Barlow, the older of the two, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sheriff, Carraway called it in like it was urgent HOA business. She made it sound like a violation that could lead to conflict. We figured showing up would calm things down. McAdams leaned forward. Did you ask whether you had legal grounds to enter? Dunley answered, his voice low. No, sir. She was forceful. Said it was a community enforcement issue, and we didn't want to escalate it in front of neighbors. The sheriff rubbed his temples. So you walked into a private cabin with no warrant, no probable cause, and the Attorney General himself sitting at the table? Do you realize how bad this looks?" Both deputies dropped their eyes. Meanwhile, Roland Pike wasn't letting the issue fade. That afternoon, he held a press conference outside the Oconee County Courthouse. Cameras crowded the steps, local reporters elbowing for space alongside state media who'd caught wind of the bizarre showdown. Roland's voice was calm but unflinching. This is not only about an HOA president overstepping her authority. It is also about law enforcement being pulled into situations where no crime has occurred, used as tools of intimidation. We cannot allow badges to be leveraged for personal vendettas. Trevor stood behind him, not speaking, but his presence carried weight. To many watching, he wasn't just a homeowner anymore. He was a symbol of what happened when ordinary citizens faced down a system stacked against them. Back at the community, reactions split even further. Supporters of Judith argued that the deputies were only doing their job, responding to a concerned call from the HOA president. Critics countered that just doing their job didn't excuse blindly walking into someone's property. At a neighborhood barbecue that weekend, Trevor overheard a heated exchange between two men. If law enforcement sides with an HOA president every time she has a complaint, then what's to stop her from knocking on anyone's door? One argued. The other shot back. You think the deputies had a choice? If they ignored her and something went wrong, everyone would have blamed them. They were stuck. Trevor listened quietly, but Roland, standing beside him, leaned in. You see, this is exactly why we can't let this fade. When authority gets blurred, when people aren't sure who's in the right, it erodes trust in the entire system. That evening, Sheriff McAdams called Trevor directly. His voice carried the weight of someone caught between politics and principle. Mr. Gaines, I want you to know those deputies will face an internal review. I can't speak for what Caraway told them, but I won't let my department be painted as her muscle. Trevor appreciated the call, but he didn't miss the undertone. The sheriff wasn't only concerned with fairness, he was protecting his department's reputation. Still, the cracks were showing. Residents who once kept their heads down were now speaking up about both Judith and the deputies. Old stories surfaced, times when neighbors said they felt pressured, times when officers seemed to show up more for association complaints than for actual crimes. But the scrutiny of the deputies was only the beginning, because as more residents began sharing their own experiences, a deeper history of Judith's behavior started to come into focus, and the community could no longer pretend it was isolated. By the following week, the narrative had shifted again. What started as whispers and Facebook debates was turning into testimony. Neighbors began coming forward, each carrying their own story of how Judith Caraway had wielded her position in the HOA like a personal weapon. It began with Callie Brenner's folder of fines and letters, but soon others followed. Frank Dillman gathered a small group at his back porch one evening, inviting Trevor and Roland to sit in. The air smelled of grilled chicken and pine smoke, but the conversation was anything but casual. Frank leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I've been waiting a long time for someone to finally put her in check. Truth is, I've got a box full of notices from her. Once she fined me $200 because the grass at the edge of my driveway was an inch too tall after a week of rain. Said it ruined neighborhood uniformity. A woman named Evelyn Parks shook her head, clutching a stack of yellowed papers in her lap. She came after me for having a porch swing. Said it didn't match the aesthetic. My husband built that swing before he passed. I wasn't about to take it down, but she threatened court. I ended up moving it to the backyard just to stop the letters. Her voice cracked, and Trevor felt a knot tighten in his chest. It wasn't just him. It was dozens of people, maybe more, all silenced over the years by Judith's authority and the threat of costly legal battles. Roland took notes carefully, his pen scratching across the page. Every one of these incidents paints a pattern. Alone they look petty. Together they show an abuse of authority. Frank's wife, Marlene, chimed in. She knows most people don't have the time or money to fight back, so they give in. And the board? They're too scared of her to speak up. Trevor leaned back in his chair, letting the voices wash over him. It was overwhelming. Each story added weight, and yet it also gave him strength. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a collective reckoning. Word spread quickly that residents were meeting and sharing stories. Some quietly handed Trevor envelopes with photocopied letters. Others slipped him screenshots of emails where Judith's tone was less about fairness and more about intimidation. One evening, a younger couple, Marcus and Tessa Van, stopped by Trevor's cabin with a USB drive. Marcus's voice was low, cautious. "These are recordings from board meetings. Judith didn't know my phone was picking them up. You'll hear her talking about targeting people she thinks don't fit the neighborhood image." Trevor's hands clenched as he slid the drive into his laptop. The words that spilled from the speakers were sharp, cutting. Judith's voice was unmistakable. "We can't just let anyone do what they want. If we give an inch, we'll lose control of this place. People like Gaines need to be taught that rules are rules." The room went silent except for the faint hum of the recording. Roland's jaw tightened, and he clicked the file closed. That's the kind of evidence that can't be ignored. She wasn't enforcing rules, she was targeting residents. Trevor stared at the blank screen, his chest heavy. "So, it wasn't just me. She made me the example because she thought no one would push back." Roland looked at him squarely. "She miscalculated." Meanwhile, Judith sensed the ground shifting beneath her. She had built her reputation on fear and compliance, but now her authority was bleeding away. In response, she dug in harder. She started holding private gatherings with her staunchest supporters, telling them Trevor was stirring chaos, painting Roland as an outsider meddling in neighborhood affairs. At one of those gatherings, overheard by a resident who later repeated it to Trevor, Judith snapped, "If they think they can strip me of my authority, they've got another thing coming. This community needs order, and I'm the only one willing to keep it." But her words sounded more desperate than commanding. The next HOA bulletin, normally filled with lawn care reminders, read more like a manifesto. "We must remain vigilant against individuals who threaten the integrity of our neighborhood," Judith wrote, without naming Trevor directly, but leaving little doubt about her target. Trevor read it aloud at his kitchen table, shaking his head. "She's cornered, but she still thinks she can win." Roland's response was steady. "Her words are evidence of intent. She's framing herself as the protector while ignoring the voices of dozens of residents. The more she speaks, the more she reveals." The community was at a tipping point. Some residents clung to Judith, fearful of change, convinced that without her the neighborhood would spiral into chaos. But more and more began to realize the cost of her control, the silenced voices, the petty fines, the threats hidden in polite language. Trevor felt the weight of those stories every time a neighbor handed him another letter, another piece of proof. And he knew one thing: the fight had grown bigger than a dock or a set of lights. But as the evidence piled higher, Judith's grip weakened, and that's when Roland Pike made his move, stepping out of the shadows of private meetings and into the public eye to call for accountability. When Roland Pike decided to step out from behind the closed doors of living rooms and porches, the entire county felt the shift. Until then, the Attorney General had been a figurehead in the background of the HOA dispute, supportive of Trevor, yes, but quiet, letting residents' stories speak for themselves. That changed on a cool Monday morning when Roland walked up the courthouse steps in Walhalla with a small group of neighbors at his side. Cameras clicked. Reporters shouted questions. For the first time, the story wasn't just about Judith Carraway and Trevor Gaines. It was about whether an entire neighborhood had been subject to selective harassment under the cloak of community rules. Roland's voice carried through the microphones with sharp clarity. "We are here because what happened at Mr. Gaines's cabin is not an isolated incident. It is part of a long-standing pattern of intimidation and unequal enforcement by an HOA president who has forgotten her role. Homeowners deserve protection, not persecution, and law enforcement must not be misused to enforce personal vendettas." Behind him, Trevor stood quietly, shoulders squared, while Frank Dillman and Callie Brenner flanked the group with copies of their notices in hand. For once, the faces of ordinary residents were front and center, not tucked away in silence. The press conference lasted less than 20 minutes, but it landed like a hammer. Local news led with the headline, "Attorney General calls out HOA over abuse of authority." Statewide outlets picked it up too. Suddenly, Judith's binder of rules was no longer her shield. It was a symbol of excess, of petty power run wild. That evening, Roland appeared on a local news station. Sitting across from the anchor under bright studio lights, he spoke calmly, but his words cut deep. When rules become tools for discrimination or selective targeting, they are no longer rules. They are weapons. And when citizens are threatened in their own homes, it is my responsibility to intervene. Judith, watching from her living room, slammed her remote down hard enough to crack the plastic casing. She felt the walls closing in. Her allies were still loyal, but even they were shaken by the sight of the Attorney General standing shoulder to shoulder with neighbors they'd dismissed as complainers. The next morning, she fired off an email blast to every resident. "This community is under attack from outsiders who don't understand the importance of our standards," she wrote. "I urge each of you to stand with me to protect what we have built." But the response was mixed. Some neighbors replied with messages of support, others ignored it, and a growing number forwarded the email directly to Trevor with a simple note. "She's doubling down." Meanwhile, Roland wasn't finished. He arranged a public forum at the county library, inviting residents to share their stories openly. The turnout was larger than anyone expected. Over 50 people packed into the room, filling the rows of chairs and standing along the back wall. One by one, residents stood to speak. Evelyn Parks described her porch swing. Callie talked about her children's basketball hoop. Frank detailed years of petty fines. Each testimony added weight to the case Roland was building. When Trevor's turn came, he spoke plainly. "I didn't move here to fight. I bought a cabin to fish, to spend time with my family, to find peace. But peace doesn't mean silence when you're treated unfairly. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone in this room." The crowd applauded, not wildly, but steady and affirming. For Trevor, it was a moment he never expected, to stand not just as a target, but as a voice for others who had been silenced. Reporters in the back scribbled furiously, capturing every word. By the next day, the forum was headline news. The image of Trevor standing at the podium with Roland seated beside him became the photo plastered across websites and front pages. Judith, furious, called a private meeting of her closest allies. "He's turning this into a circus," she snapped. "We cannot let him dictate the narrative. We must remind people that without order, this neighborhood will fall apart." But even as she spoke, her allies shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at the floor, others avoided her eyes. They had seen the crowd at the library. They had heard the applause. And they knew momentum was slipping. Back at the cabin that evening, Trevor sat with Roland by the fire, papers spread across the coffee table. "Feels like we're finally breaking through," Trevor said softly. Roland gave a small nod. "We are, but breaking through isn't enough. We have to make..." But while Roland was building a case in the open, Judith was plotting behind closed doors, preparing for one last, desperate attempt to keep her grip on power. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the community center no longer looked like a small-town gathering spot. Cars lined both sides of the narrow road leading to it, headlights cutting across the trees as residents rushed to grab seats. The tension was thick enough to feel before anyone even stepped inside. Trevor Gaines sat in the second row, Roland Pike at his side, his face unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. The buzz of conversation quieted when Judith Carraway entered the room. She carried her binder like a general walking into battle, her chin tilted high, but her eyes darted quickly across the crowd. She saw fewer friendly faces than before. Judith rapped the gavel sharply. "This meeting is now in session." She wasted no time. "Recent events have brought unwanted attention to our community. I stand by my actions. Everything I've done has been to protect property values, safety, and the quality of life we've worked so hard to preserve." A few loyalists clapped, but the sound was weak, swallowed by the silence of dozens who didn't. Trevor stood, his voice steady. "With respect, Judith, what you've done is the opposite of protection. You've used your title to intimidate. You've ignored paperwork, singled out families, and threatened people with fines and letters until they gave up. That's not leadership. That's control." Judith's eyes narrowed. And who are you to speak for this community? You're new here. You don't understand the work that's gone into making this neighborhood what it is. Before Trevor could respond, Evelyn Parks rose from her chair. Her voice trembled, but grew stronger with each word. I've lived here for 20 years, Judith. You made me move the porch swing my husband built. Said it didn't match the aesthetic. That wasn't about rules. That was about power. A murmur ran through the crowd. Then Frank Dillman stood. You fined me over grass and paint chips. You ignored the Johnsons' oversized dock but came after Trevor like he was a criminal. That's not fairness, and we all know it. Judith slammed her gavel. This is out of order. Roland rose then, and the room stilled instantly. His voice carried the same weight it had at the courthouse steps. Order is exactly what we need, Ms. Carroway. True order, built on fairness, equality, and respect. Not fear, not favoritism. Judith's face reddened. This is a homeowners association meeting, not a courtroom. You have no jurisdiction here. Roland didn't flinch. You're right. I don't run this board, but I do represent the laws of this state. And when an HOA crosses the line into harassment, when residents are intimidated under the guise of rules, that becomes my business, and I assure you, the law will not look kindly on what's been happening here. Gasps echoed across the room. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, whispering to each other. Sandra Kim, who had been silent in earlier meetings, finally spoke. Judith, maybe it's time to step aside. We can't keep pretending everything is fine when half the neighborhood feels attacked. Judith snapped back. Step aside? I've held this community together for years. Without me, property values would sink. Standards would crumble. Trevor's voice cut through the noise. Standards don't crumble when people are treated fairly. They crumble when trust is broken. And that's what you've done. The room erupted. Applause from some, angry mutters from others. The divide was sharp, but the momentum was shifting. Judith's loyalists tried to shout over the noise. She's the only one keeping order, one man called. But the crowd wasn't buying it the way they once did. Roland raised his hand, and the room quieted again. This isn't about docks, or lights, or porch swings. This is about whether power will be used to protect or to punish. And tonight, you all have the chance to decide which path this community will take. Sandra Kim motioned to the board. I think it's time for a vote. Judith's face froze. A vote? Sandra nodded firmly. Yes, a vote of no confidence in your leadership. The room broke into chaos. Cheers from some, protests from others. Judith banged her gavel furiously, shouting, You have no authority to call such a vote! But her words sounded thinner now, weaker against the tide of voices rising around her. Trevor sat quietly, watching the moment unfold. For the first time since he'd bought his cabin, he felt the weight of community leaning in his favor. Not completely, not yet, but enough to show Judith's reign, but the vote was only the beginning. What came after, the fallout, the choices, the lessons, would decide whether the community healed or fractured beyond repair. The vote of no confidence didn't happen that night, not officially. Judith pounded her gavel until the wood splintered, insisting procedure hadn't been followed, that the board needed more notice. But the moment had already slipped out of her grasp. The residents had seen her rattled, they'd seen her cornered, and they'd seen their own voices amplified instead of silenced. Even without the paperwork finalized, the verdict was written in the faces of the crowd. Her power was broken. Over the next week, the neighborhood changed in subtle but undeniable ways. For the first time in years, residents walked their dogs and actually stopped to talk with each other about more than weather or lawn care. People who had once avoided eye contact now compared notes about their own experiences with Judith. The fear that kept everyone quiet had lifted, leaving room for something new: accountability. At his cabin, Trevor felt the shift too. Strangers turned neighbors stopped by with baked goods, with copies of letters they had received, even just with words of encouragement. One older man clasped Trevor's hand firmly and said, "You gave us all a backbone." About time someone did. Trevor shook his head. "I didn't do this alone. I just opened the door." Meanwhile, Roland Pike filed a formal inquiry into the HOA's practices. He called for an audit of fines, letters, and enforcement records going back 5 years. The announcement made headlines statewide, placing Judith at the center of a storm she could no longer control. Even some of her staunchest allies began to distance themselves, muttering that she'd gone too far. One evening, Trevor sat with Roland on the cabin's porch as the sun melted into Lake Kiowee, painting the water gold. The Attorney General set his coffee cup on the railing and said, "You know, Trevor, most people don't realize how much damage small abuses of power can cause. They look minor, even petty, until you see the pattern. Then it's clear. They're poison. Slow, quiet poison." Trevor nodded. "I just wanted peace. A place to fish, a place for family. Didn't think I'd be fighting a war with an HOA president." Roland gave a faint smile. "Sometimes peace only comes after you stand up for it." Their conversation was interrupted by the crunch of tires on gravel. Judith Carroway herself stepped out of a sedan, her face pale but determined. She walked up the steps, binder clutched tightly, though she no longer looked like the unshakable president of weeks past. She looked like a woman carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Trevor stood, wary but calm. "Judith." She didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she spoke quickly, words tumbling out. "I came to say, I've decided to step down, effective immediately. I'll be resigning from the HOA presidency. I realize my efforts to protect this neighborhood have been misunderstood, and I no longer wish to cause division." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. She set the binder down on the porch table like it was burning her hands. Then, without waiting for a response, she turned and walked back to her car. Trevor and Roland stood in silence as the taillights disappeared down the road. For all the battles, for all the noise, her resignation landed with quiet finality. Frank Dillman stopped by later that evening, grinning as he leaned against the railing. "Looks like she finally waved the white flag. Guess we'll have to elect someone who actually listens to us." Trevor smiled faintly. "That's the hope." The neighborhood did more than elect a new president. They rewrote the bylaws, this time with residents present, ensuring fairness and transparency were built into the structure itself. Callie Brenner joined the board, her kids finally free to shoot hoops in the driveway without fear of another letter. Evelyn Parks rehung her porch swing proudly, saying her late husband would have wanted it that way. As weeks passed, Trevor finally found what he had wanted all along. Quiet mornings fishing on the lake, evenings with nieces and nephews laughing around a fire pit. But this time, those moments carried a deeper meaning. He wasn't just enjoying peace. He had earned it, and he had helped others claim it too. One Saturday, as neighbors gathered for a cookout on Frank's lawn, Roland gave Trevor a quiet nod. "You know, not every fight has to end in bitterness. Sometimes it ends in change." Trevor looked around at the laughter, the clinking of soda cans, the kids running barefoot in the grass. He thought about the porch swing, the basketball hoop, the dock lights glowing soft against the lake. Little things, but each a piece of freedom. "You're right," Trevor said softly. "Sometimes change is the victory." The story of Judith Carroway's fall from power became a cautionary tale in the county, not about HOA disputes or dock extensions, but about what happens when people stop accepting intimidation as normal. It reminded everyone that fairness doesn't trickle down from authority, it rises when ordinary people refuse to stay quiet. And for Trevor Gaines, it was a reminder of something simpler. Peace isn't given. It's built, defended, and shared. If this story moved you, remember, silence in the face of unfairness only strengthens it. Speak up, stand together, and protect what matters. And if you want more stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe.